writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business, coming to you from Kobo's headquarters in Toronto. Hi everyone, welcome to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. I'm Stephanie, and today Rene is joining me, and we have had him on the podcast before doing interviews with Lauren Weisberger.
Yes.
That was our most latest one, but
Robin Harding and Vivica Fox.
Exactly. So can you tell listeners a bit about you, because you have not introed yourself before?
I will do so right now. My name is Rene. I've worked at Kobo for over 6 years. I work in the communications department, which means I work with many different departments within the company, and I love doing these interviews.
All right. And so you sat down with Dr. Lee Airton talking about gender. What else did you talk about? So I was about to say guys, and folks is okay, but sometimes guys is not accepted as like a overall plural for someone.
Right. So the idea behind this book is just to show people how to use gender-neutral language, for example. As opposed to saying guys or ladies, you can say, "Hi everyone, how's your meal tonight?" for example. Mm-hmm. It's just tips and tricks on creating a gender-friendly environment for everyone involved. And everyone is a gender expert, is what Dr. Lee Airton talks about. So whether you think about it or not, you are an expert on gender, and so is everyone else.
All right.
In very different ways. It's just that now there's more and more people who are openly living as transgender men or women, but there's many transgender people that now don't live in the binary world. And for example, Dr. Lee Airton goes by they. And you'll hear more about that when you listen to the interview.
All right. So I bet you guys will say it better than me. So without further ado, here is the interview.
Gender means many things. To many, it generally means male or female, but it really does mean much more. Can you tell us a bit about your goal for this book and what you hope people will get from it?
Thanks for having me. That's a good question. My goal for the book is to expand the conversation around the ways in which gender doesn't work for people who are transgender, and to expand that conversation to reflect what we actually know about gender, which is that when it's very rigid, it actually doesn't work for anybody. So often we see conversations and resources about gender that are geared towards either people who are trans or people who aren't. And the goal of Gender Your Guide is actually to speak across that divide to help folks who aren't transgender to understand what they already know about gender and the kinds of things that they can do to make it less rigid for everybody. So it's a text that I hope is going to do a lot of different kinds of bridge building work. And if it does some of that, then I'll be happy.
You talk about a lot about the language used when speaking about the transgender community, and that's super important.
I love your question because I think that what makes people who aren't trans and who aren't sort of part of our community kind of nervous talking about trans issues is the sphere of terminology and of getting it wrong. And well, there are a couple things that it's really important to avoid. Well, part of the project that I am working on with this book and with other things and with my academic research is to decenter terminology a little bit and to make it real and okay that people will have questions and that people will make mistakes. So transgender versus transgendered is a really interesting distinction. And the reason why many trans people aren't really into transgendered anymore is because it sounds like something that happened to you in the past, right? So a person who transgendered, it's kind of like a past tense verb. And for many of us, transgender isn't something that happens to us and then we move on and live our lives as people who are men or women. I mean, that's certainly true of some trans people. Still, most of the time don't like the transgendered word, but most of us have a sense of ourselves as transgender that actually doesn't change. So what we do change about ourselves are different ways of living in our body to become more comfortable and to become more who we are. But it isn't something that happens to us then disappears. It's actually who we are. We are trans people. We're not just people who gone through something and come out the other side, for many of us. So that's one of the reasons why transgendered has fallen into disuse in favor of transgender.
You also talk a lot about, I think you open the book with a story about public bathrooms, which can often be a big source of anxiety, right, for a trans person. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, sure. Bathrooms are a site of considerable labor. So I think most people in the world, when they think about, I'm going to leave the house today, a thing they do not think about is, okay, I have to figure out where I'm going to go to the bathroom, right? Am I going to have this extra cup of coffee, right? Am I going to have water with my lunch? Because I'm going to have to use the washroom. And if I can't find one that's going to be either a single gender washroom or washroom in a place where I feel safe, then I'm going to not be able to access that public space, right? Like that mall, that restaurant, that store, etc. Yeah, so bathrooms are a big site of labor and thought and time and effort for a lot of different trans people, but not all trans people, but many of us. So what often happens to me is when I go into a bathroom that's for women or for men, people tend to be very confused about my presence. And most of the places that I go, and because of different ways in which I'm privileged, I don't tend to receive a lot of any kind of violence in my life. That hasn't been my story, but definitely a lot of things that are discriminatory. People telling me I'm in the wrong one, people giving me messages that I shouldn't be there, making me feel very unsafe. So yeah, it's a question of what am I going to do to look and to present myself and to behave as if I'm in the right one, whatever one, for these few minutes so that I don't receive any of those reactions and potentially make myself unsafe.
Can you give us a few tips, for example, or how do people approach making their spaces more gender friendly?
Gender friendly is a term that I developed for this book because I wanted to give people a sense of how they can be more welcoming in ways that are kind of about what you say, but also kind of about what you don't say or how you say it, or not just what you do, but what you don't do. There's all kinds of little ways that you can welcome the infinite different ways that people live gender in everyday life. And a lot of that is coming to realize that we all do gender in our own way. And we all participate in making gender very rigid. So how you react to someone else sharing something about themselves, or how you react when someone walks into a space, those are all ways that we participate in making this stuff really rigid. And we can actually make a decision to not participate in that way, right? To not make our own expectations somebody else's problem, but actually to kind of manifest with our words and our actions that they know themselves best, and they are the person who's the best judge of whether the space is right for them. So there's all kinds of different practical tips in the book, but one of my personal favorite sections is called How to Stop Telling People Who They Are Without Meaning to in the Gender Department. And that is all about what it looks like when, for example, we greet someone who is a woman who we think has lost a lot of weight by telling her that she looks amazing, because that is part of being in the woman box, or very strict rules around how your body shape or body size should be. And when we tell someone that that's good news, then we're also telling her that she wasn't good enough before. And what if she lost all that weight for a reason she isn't happy about, like anxiety or stress or a bad life change or an illness? So a more gender-friendly practice to loosen up the rules around the woman box is to say, hey, how are you?
Right. Just like a normal question, right? Yeah.
See what follows from that, instead of telling somebody who they are and who they aren't.
Right. It's definitely a process, and you're very clear in the book that that's okay.
When you make a mistake or whatever, I mean, as long as you don't make too much of a big deal about it, but enact the kind of correction I talked about, which is just sorry and rephrase and move on with no drama.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that, because you speak a lot about, for example, gender-neutral pronouns, and for yourself, for example, you use they or them. Can we talk a bit about that, and what do we do if you hear somebody or you make a mistake?
Yeah, so if you make a mistake with my pronoun and you notice, that's pretty great. So I'm an educator. I work with beginning teachers, and part of what we talk about in education is having expectations that allow for the possibility of success, and then building on that success, right? So when I notice that people around me, especially when we're just getting to know each other, when I notice they're catching themselves, then that is something that for me is a sign of success. So it's not perfect, but it is excellent. And it is a building block to the next step, which is learning to use a pronoun that we all use every day, but for a different reason, which is to talk about someone you know. Yeah, so the best thing to do when you make a mistake, first of all, be excited that you noticed, because that's the first step. That's like a building block to being able to use gender pronouns for people. And then you can just say, sorry, they're talking on the Kobo podcast, and then move on, right? So even if you feel like, I'm a terrible person and I made a mistake, and, they're going to think I'm not whatever, I'm not an ally, or blah, 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 just bottle that up, because that's legit, but that's not for me, right? That's not something I need to hear, because I think what we want if we're becoming friends is for me to feel like I can correct you, and it's not going to be like a huge deal that's going to derail our entire conversation and draw excessive amounts of attention to my pronoun and to what I'm saying. So the best thing you can do is actually to keep cool, to say sorry, rephrase, move on, cool as a cucumber, take that away and let that out. A great gift you can give to folks like me is to not make that my problem.
Right. Now, going back to the pronoun they and them, let's talk a bit about the grammar implication. Tell us a bit about the using they for one person and how long it's been in use.
Goodness. Well, one of my great pleasures in writing the book was owning up to the fact that I'm not a person who studies English in that way. So I have some friends, Bronwyn Bjorkman, who's a professor of linguistics at Queen's, and Lex Kennelly, who's a doctoral student at U of T, and they offer wonderful information about grammar in the book. So I'd like to send your readers to them for the more technical questions. But yeah, so singular they is funny because it does feel new to people when you're using it for someone like me, and you're using it for someone who you know and whom you have some information about. So that's new, but there's a misconception about singular they that it's totally new. In fact, you, Rene, and me, and all the people who we can possibly think about who are speaking English have already said singular they dozens of times this morning, right? So they've already done that because we use singular they for people we don't know. Like, there's someone knocking at the door, they're early. Like, if I don't know who that person is, then I'm going to be talking about them using singular they without even thinking about it. So singular they is grammatically correct. There is no dispute about that. And what's new, what feels new to people, is using it in a different way for a person we already know. So the grammar argument's a funny one, and I talk about it in the book because grammar arguing people are often people who consider themselves, and generally are, consider themselves to be very sort of wordy, grammarian-y, literate, like highly literate. So there are often folks like that who are very stridently holding on to the grammar argument, even in the face of different kinds of evidence, are often people who just feel extremely uncomfortable with awkwardness when they're speaking English. So it's a funny moment when very sort of highly competent, highly fluent English speakers are people who have more of a problem than people who are learning English, you know, because they're like, oh, this is another thing that I'm learning. Whereas if you don't identify as a learner of a language you speak, then you have a lot more trouble. So it kind of flips assumptions on its head about who would have trouble with singular they. And it's not actually people who are learning as much as these sort of highfalutin, highly literate Englishy people.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I thought it was interesting how you can reword the way you say things or write things down without using pronouns, for example. So for you, if I was writing you a letter, I could say, Dear Dr. Lee Airton. So I thought that was interesting, the examples you give about how you can refer to somebody without saying ladies, gentlemen, you know, that kind of thing you hear in restaurants and in customer service a lot, which I thought was super interesting. You can just talk to them by just saying, how was your meal?
You can convey a lot of formality without needing to have gender binary language.
You mentioned that, you know, a bit of humor goes a long way. I find you quite funny. There was a line in your book that said, so if don't commit a crime while misgendering someone and you'll be fine. that seems like an easy lesson. Yeah, it does seem like an easy lesson. Just don't commit a crime against somebody and you'll be fine. That should go for all kinds of things. Can you give us an example of a situation you've been in where you've used a bit of humor and it's worked in your favor? I'm assuming a lot of times, but is there any situation that stands out for you?
Oh, yeah. Well, humor is, I'm a silly person, and it's sometimes hard for me to remember that silliness is not always the best way forward. But an example where I have used humor every day. I think what I really like, as someone who has lived gender in different ways in my life and who's come to this wonderful place of being non-binary, I kind of feel, like I say in the book, like a bit of a secret agent. I can see a lot of the invisible and unspoken gender dimensions of all different kinds of interactions and assumptions that people make without saying things kind of jump out at me. And it's an incredible asset as a teacher about these issues. But when I'm engaging with other people, what I often know is what kinds of things a person is usually given compliments about because of how they are perceived by others, and what kinds of things are qualities or characteristics that are wonderful, but are probably not things other folks feel like they'd like to have complimented, which is a huge assumption, because we usually think of like, oh, when would a woman like to be told she looks nice? Or when would a man like to be told that he did a good job? Or what are things that men or women would like other people to not really notice very much because they don't sort of fit in with the expectations for them in these different gender boxes. So what I like to do is to notice things that people are excited about that aren't things they usually get complimented about, like a woman doing something that's really sort of strong or competitive or whatever, and really just like getting in there and being like, roar, that's awesome. And then there's this like, it's funny, but it's not haha funny. It's just like an excess of emotion, like you're letting something out. Like, yes, you are seeing this part of myself and making it a thing we're talking about. And that's awesome. And let's just camp it up and make it so big and out there. So like one of my favorite things is like the bocce tournament that happens at my workplace, because that dynamic is just everywhere. And it's not usually a place where sport isn't usually a place where a lot of women show that side of themselves. So I guess it's a roundabout answer question, but noticing those things and drawing them out is one of my greatest pleasures in my life with other folks.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned that sometimes people will target you for your own mistake and be like, aha, you made a mistake. Does that happen? Yeah.
Sure. And I think that's hilarious. And it's actually really instructive for people. Like every so often, if someone's pronoun changes or I'm using a new pronoun for somebody, then of course I'll make a mistake now and then. And I do catch myself because, you know, it's the thing I do. I tend to catch myself right away. But I love it when people do that to me, because in that relationship, I'm usually always the teacher. So that to me feels like, it doesn't feel bad. It just feels like we're in that relationship. And that's like, it's always funny when your teacher gets something wrong and you're like, aha, you know. It's also in a weird roundabout way, like a show of respect, because it matters that you got it wrong. So that doesn't bother me at all. And I actually think it's hilarious.
And some trans people decide to have surgeries, some don't, and some decide to have top surgery or bottom surgery or whatever. And I guess it doesn't matter if you get a surgery or not.
No, but and a big message of the book, I mean, I have a very short section on transition, and I preface it by saying, I mean, this section is like way back in the chapter for these reasons, is that's often a thing that cisgender people particularly want to know about. But actually, it's useful to have a bit of information about transition to counter different kinds of harmful myths. But actually, to welcome a person, regardless of how they're doing gender at one moment in their lives, doesn't need anyone to know anything about anyone's medical history. And decentering our own need to know is a very gender-friendly practice.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's talk about books for a little bit, if you don't mind, because we are a book company. I was just wondering if you could tell us just a couple, 2 or 3 of your favorites. And do you have any recommendations where there would be a trans person as the main character in fiction?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, you know, I'm going to be a little bit retro, and I'm going to suggest a YA novel called Parrotfish. And Parrotfish is an older novel where the main character is trans. But what I like about Parrotfish is that there's all different kinds of gender non-conforming behavior and gender expression in the novel. So sometimes what we have with different kinds of fiction with trans characters is a novel where everyone's gender is kind of set in stone, and then you have a trans person who goes from one side of the binary to the other, right? So which is a very sort of common trans pathway. But what I love about Parrotfish, and I kind of want to bring it back, it's old now, is that there's all kinds of gender transgression, and there's all kinds of ways that gender is not what we'd expect for all the characters. And that actually reflects life. So everyone is in some way, to some extent, not quite who other people expected, not quite fitting in the box right. And so I'm just going to give a shout back to Parrotfish. But I'm also going to shout out one of my personal heroes, and I'm absolutely over the moon and honored to have an endorsement of my book on my website from them, is Ivan Coyote. Ivan Coyote's Tomboy Survival Guide, Gender Failure with Ray Spoon. I've been learning from listening to Ivan and their stories for 15 years. I grew up in the same town where Ivan lives. Hearing Ivan sort of bring to life what it is to move about in the world and confounding other people's gender expectations, that is an art form that Ivan has developed over decades of doing this work. And I'm a student of theirs. And I strongly recommend Ivan's writing to anybody who wants a more, after they've read Gender Your Guide or before without reading it, but who wants a bit more of a first-person sort of story way of understanding what it's like to be outside those expectations. And also a family member and a community member, Ivan's books are for you.
Great. I'm going to check them out. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I think this has been a great chat, and I think it's stuff that people need to know.
Awesome. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we hope you enjoyed our interview with Dr. Lee Airton, and we hope you learned something new today. This is something we haven't had on the podcast before. So thanks, Rene, for doing the interview for us.
Thanks for having me, and I can't wait to come back on your podcast soon.
We can't wait to have you. Joni, what's our social media?
Check out our blog at kobowritinglife.com. Follow us on Instagram at kobo.writing.life, and follow us on Twitter at kobowritinglife.
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And until next time, have a great holiday. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we provide insights and stories from leaders and experimenters in the world of self-publishing.
If you want even more information about growing your Kobo sales, check out our blog or find us on social.
And if you're just finding us and ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing!